Let's go to the two biggest, I think, open puzzles in trade policy. The first, why, if we want to make redistributions, why do we do it through trade policy? There's infinite well, not infinite, but a long list of more efficient ways of doing it that do not mess with relative prices and international trade. And number two, why is it that trade policies are biased against trade? Why is it that when you don't observe free trade, it's always import tariffs and not import subsidies? And the literature, let me go very quickly over this, has focused mostly on two things, which I alluded to already. One, which is our favorite explanation by far, is lobbies, and the other is traditional voting models. I mentioned the median voter model, but you could have extensions of this. And what I want to emphasize, because it will be different in the type of explanation that I suggest, is that in these models, the same people, the same groups, matter for all policy decisions. And this is a constraint that comes from the nature of political power. You're powerful because you can organize into a lobby and you can contribute. You're powerful because you're a swing voter and you're likely to decide the election. And this applies to the election, to politics as a whole. The information sharing between a group gives it political power. It leads naturally to the idea that a special interest group, an organization, would want to control it. And so I suggest that the members of a group, everybody who owns a specific factor, belongs to a lobby, a former lobby, and that what this lobby does is to control access to the network. And you might think that what the lobby wants to do is to share the information between all its members, make them all informed so they will have political power. And this is the minimum it can do. The lobby, in fact, can do better. And what the lobby wants to do is to exclude some of the people. Why would it want to exclude some of the people? Because they are not committed enough. I really want to talk to specialized workers, engineers, skilled workers on the assembly lines, because they are really committed to the sector. They really want protection for the sector. And if you do that, you cut off people who don't have enough of the specific factor, you get more protection. And you get more protection when the sector is small, when public information is scarce, and when factor ownership is heavily concentrated, because you can get this small group of super committed people who are so much more informed than anybody else that they will really sway policy. And in fact, there's even a moment where this strategy is so powerful for the lobby that the lobby can get its first best strategy. There's only two things that are needed. One, you need the public to be sufficiently uninformed. You cannot get away with controlling policy if policy decisions are well known by the average person. And B, the lobby must not want something too incredible. So the lobby must be large enough that it internalizes enough of the deadweight laws that it doesn't want, a crazy level of protection. You cannot get 500% tariffs on your sector like this. Nothing worse than the common agricultural policy, I suppose. But I want, and here I will put only a very little bit of math. There's a lot more, but time is a constraint, and you haven't come here to see all my math. There's promised another avenue, which is far from mutually exclusive, which is investment in acquiring information. And this only really requires a simple intuition, which is that voters have no incentives, or in reality they have few incentives, but in the model it's really zero, to acquire information about policy. And we know this, or we think we know it, from sociology, from political science. The acquisition, the listening to news about politics is a consumption decision. I read the newspaper and I want to know how politics goes because I'm curious, because it's my way of procrastinating. And even for me, and I do work in the field, if you are a regular guy, it's purely a consumption decision. Conversely, producers need to make ex-ante investments. And here, the ex-ante investment they need to make is just hiring labor, which, since it's a Ricardo-Wiener model, there's only one mobile factor, will be equivalent to predetermining output. And as a consequence, learning the correct future price instead of keeping an expectation of the future price is valuable. This is the value of moving from the profit of an expectation to the expectation of a profit for every convex profit function this has positive value. And in many industries, one of the things you want to do when you are estimating future prices is thinking about political risk. What will the policy decision be? How will it change if, you know, the left or the right wins the election? And this gives the producers an incentive to listen to proposals for their own sector, and not for the others, because they are not making investments over that. And as a consequence, the timing of the election needs to change a little bit, and I didn't want to keep you in the dark. Now, after the parties observe the international price, which the voters don't necessarily know, they make their choices, and then the voters invest in information acquisition. And depending on their investment, they increase their probability of learning the conditions of the sector, which means the international price and the proposals of the two parties, which will give them the actual price conditional on the outcome of the election. And then the rest is as before. Now, what happens, I can solve for a few different equilibria, always with the assumption that that policy is separable across issues, as it should be economically, since there's no economic cross-linkage across them, and I get multiple predictions which are consistent with the overall intuition. Number one, at least in expectation, every industry gets positive protection. You may have that in some cases you want to exploit the uninformed producer by surprising them. This is a classic problem of dynamic inconsistency. But on the whole, either you always have protection or on average the sector is protected. And protection, again, is higher when the public is less informed, is lower when producers are numerous, and finally, it is also higher when price forecasts are more valuable. You need to make an investment if prices have lots of variance in a very volatile sector, or in a sector in which supply and demand quantities react a lot to prices. It's more important for you to know, and so you will endogenously generate an information asymmetry. But let me emphasize again the final fact: you will not have this effect if the policy is not distorting prices. You want to do inefficient redistribution because it's the inefficiency that catches the eye of the people you are just redistributing money to, and so they would be happier about efficient redistribution, but they wouldn't know it. They wouldn't vote for you. You have to do it in a price-distorting way. And I hope I still have time. I know we were a little late in starting. I want to briefly suggest, or hopefully convince you, that the main prediction of the model, and the most positive prediction of the model, is also realistic. Throughout these models, it always was true that better public information will reduce protection, will make trade freer. And this is really most obvious in the limit. If everybody knows what the politician is doing, we are back to the baseline model. There's no sense in which you can have more information and be more powerful. This channel for particular interests or special interests to influence policy is shut down. And so I will test this together with the well-known and not novel prediction that protection should follow a Ramsey rule. So I will have a measure of tariffs on the left-hand side, and on the right I will have the Ramsey parameter alone and interacted with a measure of public information. Now, this is well known in the literature, but somewhat, people change exactly what they put here, but it's a somewhat complicated regression because the data are pretty bad. And the first problem is that our models are conveniently written in terms of tariff rates or tariff rate equivalents, but computing those is very tough. So in practice, we will use non-tariff barrier coverage, which is a measure of the percentage of tariff lines within an industry that have any trade distorting intervention. And aside from the fact that there's obviously not a linear equivalence between that and tariffs, it's also a truncated measure. It can go from 0 to 1, while tariff rates are defined on the whole real line, potentially. And so it will be run in Tobit. More important, it will be run in IV, because we have prices on the left, and if nothing else, import penetration on the right. So data, standard data on everything, imports, output, and so on. The data on protection are again limited by availability. This is what everybody uses in the literature, and I get them courtesy of Kishore Gawande. It's a cross-section of, in my case, 175 4-digit SIC manufacturing industries in the United States for the year 1983. And the fact that it's the year 1983 is actually good for me, because the way I measure public information is by going to a database of historical newspapers, and yes, the 80s are historical, and I count articles that from keyword searches constructed on the basis of the name of the sectors in the SIC manual talk about trade policy for each sector. And doing it with newspapers is good for 1983 because we know, in particular from a pioneering survey by Doris Graeber, that back in the 1980s and 1970s, Americans were learning about politics mostly from the newspapers. This would not necessarily be true today. So, well, these are the variables, they're not very interesting. These are the instruments. I need to instrument what's the standard in the literature using measures of industry composition and of factor intensity. And here are mine. I have capital intensity and the breakdown of the labor force across skill levels. And then I have measures of the structure of the industry. This is the concentration in the sectors that buy, the downstream sectors for the industry, and these are two indices of concentration for the industry itself, and then I also have unionization. And with these standard instruments, what do we get? Well, the basic results are very comforting, and so I'm happy to put them on the slides. The constant is usually insignificant, and so it is, but there's a very strong significance of the information. More information, less protection. This is true whether or not you put information on its own as a variable. And it's also true if I run as a check the original explanation, namely it's being organized into a lobby. Now this is not exactly comparable with Gawande's regression, both because my methodology is very different, he wasn't doing Tobit, and because I have fewer sectors. And I have fewer sectors because for all the miscellaneous sectors, I cannot identify coverage in the media. But if I add that doesn't show up, and the main result holds. I have some sensitivity analysis, but in the interest of not being so late, I think that this is all you get.